The little black girl warned the biker someone dragged a child into a restricted cell beneath the processing block. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get to today's story. In the heart of the city, where the sound of engines hums through the air, there's an old, forgotten block, a place where danger lurks in the shadows and secrets are buried beneath layers of concrete. On this particular evening, the air was thick with the smell of oil and gasoline, as a group of bikers gathered for their usual meetup. The usual crowd was there, tough, resilient, and bonded by loyalty. But tonight, something was different. A small, trembling figure appeared at the edge of their gathering. A young black girl, no older than 10, her eyes wide with fear, her breath ragged as she sprinted toward them. She was barefoot, her dress torn, and her small fists clenched in desperation. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Please, someone help. They took my brother." Her words sent a chill through the group. The leader, a weathered biker named Jack, stepped forward, his voice steady but concerned. "Where did they take him?" The girl pointed down a dark alley, her finger trembling. "A silver van, it went down that way." The bikers exchanged glances, their faces hardening. This wasn't just a call for help, it was a warning. Jack's mind raced as he processed the situation. This wasn't just some random act of trouble, it was something more sinister. "Get your bikes ready," he ordered. "We're going after them." With that, the roar of engines filled the night, the bikers' machines springing to life as they revved their engines, preparing for a chase. But this wasn't just about finding a lost child. No, it was much bigger than that. There was something lurking in the shadows of the city, something they hadn't counted on. The girl, still crying, turned to Jack, clutching his vest. "Please, they've got him in a restricted cell beneath the processing block. My brother, he's locked up there." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. A restricted cell beneath the processing block. He knew that place, everyone did. It was a part of the city nobody dared to approach. But this was different. This was personal. Jack looked around at his crew, their faces hard and set with determination. "We don't stop until we find him," he said. Without a second thought, the bikers formed a tight formation, their lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. As they sped through the streets, the city that had once seemed so familiar now felt like a maze of danger. They were heading straight for the heart of the unknown, and they weren't going to back down. The girl's face haunted Jack's thoughts as they pushed forward. What had happened to her brother? Why had they taken him? And what lay ahead in that cursed block? The roar of the engines drowned out all other thoughts as they raced toward the place where so many secrets were buried, ready to face whatever dangers awaited them. As the bikers sped through the streets, their engines roaring like a thunderstorm rolling in from the distance, Jack's mind raced. The girl's voice still echoed in his ears. "They took my brother." Every second felt like an eternity as they pushed further into the heart of the city. The girl, clutching his leather vest, sat at the front of Jack's bike, her small frame shaking with fear. Her tears had dried, but her eyes were still wide with terror, as though she couldn't believe they were actually going to save her brother. They had no time to lose. They had to act fast. Jack glanced at his crew, his brothers in arms, who were following close behind in tight formation. Every one of them was determined, focused. They had done dangerous rides before, but this was different. This wasn't just about a rescue. This was a message from the streets of a city that had long forgotten its humanity. They were going into unknown territory, a place where the system had turned a blind eye, and no one dared to challenge the darkness. The restricted block was infamous. It was a place that had been abandoned years ago, left to rot, and become a breeding ground for criminal activity. But it wasn't just a forgotten corner of the city anymore. The girl's brother was locked up there, and Jack wasn't going to let him stay there for one more minute. "How far?" one of the bikers called out over the radio. "We're almost there," Jack replied, his voice low and steady, despite the anxiety running through his veins. "Stay close, everyone." The bike engines hummed in unison, cutting through the night air as they took a sharp turn and approached the edge of the restricted area. The once bustling industrial zone had been reduced to crumbling concrete and rusted metal, with the occasional flickering light casting eerie shadows over the vacant buildings. This was the place. The girl's brother was somewhere inside those walls. But where exactly? No one knew. The restricted block had been abandoned by the authorities, its security tighter than ever, guarded by men who would do anything to protect the secrets buried within. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the girl's voice. "It's down there," she whispered, pointing toward a dimly lit building at the far end of the block. Jack followed her gaze and saw it. A darkened window on the ground floor, partially obscured by a broken sign. They had to move fast. The bikers pulled up to the curb in a line, their bikes idling as Jack dismounted. "Stay here," he told the girl, his voice soft but firm. "We'll get him." She nodded, her face a mix of fear and hope. Jack signaled to his crew, and they quickly fanned out, their movements coordinated, like a well-oiled machine. The plan was simple. Get in, find the boy, and get out. They didn't need anyone getting in their way. Jack motioned for Bear and Wrench to take the front, while Phantom and Storm would cover the back. "No guns unless necessary," Jack reminded them. "We're here to rescue, not to escalate." The group moved toward the building, their boots making little sound on the cracked pavement. The air felt colder now, the tension building as they approached the entrance. Jack could hear his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his composure. As they reached the door, Bear tried the handle. It was locked. Without hesitation, Bear kicked it open with a force that echoed through the empty building. Inside, it was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering overhead bulbs. The sound of their boots reverberated in the hallway, and Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The silence in the building was oppressive. Something didn't feel right. As they moved deeper into the building, Jack's eyes scanned every corner, every doorway. They had to find the boy fast. Suddenly, they heard it. A faint noise coming from one of the rooms. Jack held up his hand, signaling for the group to stop. They all went silent, listening. The sound was unmistakable, a child's cry. "This way," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The group moved toward the source of the sound, their bodies tense, ready for whatever lay ahead. As they reached the door, Jack kicked it open with one swift motion. What they saw inside made their blood run cold. The boy was there, chained to a metal chair, his face bruised and tear-streaked. The room was cold, dimly lit, with nothing but a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Jack's heart sank, but he didn't let his anger show. "We're getting you out of here," he said softly, stepping forward. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" he whispered. "We're your rescue," Jack replied. "You're safe now." The bikers moved quickly, cutting the boy's chains and helping him to his feet. But just as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jack froze. They weren't alone anymore. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. As the door slammed shut behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the dark hallway. Jack's heart raced as he turned to face the group. There was no going back now. They were trapped. The boy, still clutching Jack's side, trembled with fear. "What do we do now?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We stay calm and get out," Jack said, his voice firm. "No one gets left behind." The bikers instinctively moved into formation, their instincts sharp as ever. Bear, always the first to take charge, moved to the front, his massive frame blocking the doorway. "This isn't good," Bear muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to move fast." The rest of the crew nodded in agreement, positioning themselves in a way that protected the boy while ensuring they weren't cornered. Jack's mind raced. They had come for a rescue, but now, the stakes were higher. The room they were in was cold, with nothing but a single, flickering light bulb overhead, casting eerie shadows across the cracked concrete walls. The air felt thick, heavy with the anticipation of what was about to come. "They've set a trap," Wrench said quietly, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. "We walked right into it." Jack nodded. He could feel it too. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The place felt like a maze, with no clear way out. Suddenly, the sound of metal scraping against metal came from the other side of the room. The bikers froze, all eyes turning toward the noise. "Stay alert," Jack commanded in a low voice. His mind worked quickly. They needed to get out of there, but they couldn't leave without the boy. They had to protect him at all costs. Another crash echoed through the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices. The bikers exchanged tense glances. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of speed and preparation. Jack motioned for his crew to follow his lead. They would have to move fast, and they had to trust each other. As they moved toward the back exit, the door at the far end of the room suddenly flew open. Two men stepped into the doorway, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. Going somewhere, one of them sneered. His voice was cold, almost mocking. Jack felt his blood boil. These were the men who had been holding the boy, and now they were trying to stop them from leaving. Jack stepped forward, his body tense, ready to fight. "We're leaving with the kid," he said, his voice calm but laced with anger. "And you're not going to stop us." The man laughed, taking a step forward. "You think you can just walk out of here? This is our territory." Jack's eyes never left the man. "We're not here to start a war. But if you try to stop us, it'll be a fight you won't win." The tension in the room was palpable. The bikers stood their ground, their bodies poised for action. The man took another step, his hand reaching for something at his side. Jack's instincts kicked in. He stepped forward, grabbing the man's wrist before he could draw his weapon. "I told you," Jack said, his grip tightening. "We're not here for a fight. But if you keep pushing, we won't have a choice." The man's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. With a quick motion, he pulled free from Jack's grip and lunged at him, throwing a punch. Jack ducked, avoiding the blow and countering with a swift jab to the man's side. The man staggered back, but Jack didn't stop. He knew the others would be ready. The bikers moved in, taking down the other man with a series of quick, precise moves. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had started. Jack stood over the two men, his breathing steady, but his heart still pounding. "Move," he commanded. "We're getting out of here." The bikers moved swiftly, their feet heavy against the concrete floor as they headed toward the back exit. The boy, still clutching Jack's side, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Thank you," the boy whispered, his voice shaking. Jack gave him a small smile, his grip on the boy's shoulder reassuring. "It's not over yet," Jack said, his eyes scanning the hallway. They had to get out of the building, but they still didn't know what was waiting for them outside. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, closer now. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone anymore. It was time to leave. The bikers picked up their pace, moving quickly toward the exit. But as they turned the corner, they found themselves face to face with more men, this time, armed and ready to fight. Jack's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The odds were stacked against them, but they weren't going down without a fight. "Get ready," he said, his voice low and determined. "This isn't over." The bikers moved with urgency, their boots pounding against the concrete as they advanced toward the exit, but the situation had shifted. Their path was now blocked. The air was thick with tension. Jack's eyes scanned the darkened hallway, the faint sounds of footsteps getting louder as more men emerged from the shadows. They weren't going to let them leave without a fight. Jack could feel the weight of the boy still clinging to his side. The kid was scared, but Jack wasn't going to let anyone harm him. "We can't go back now," Jack muttered under his breath. The bikers weren't just rescuing a kid anymore. They were facing down a gang that was willing to do whatever it took to keep them trapped in this building. "Bear," Jack barked, "take point. Wrench, Phantom, you're with me. The rest, cover the rear." The crew nodded, falling into position without hesitation. Bear, the biggest of them all, moved to the front, his massive frame a wall of muscle as he brandished his weapon. Wrench and Phantom flanked Jack, ready for whatever was coming. The men who blocked their path were armed, but Jack's crew wasn't afraid. They had the element of surprise on their side, and they had each other. The leader of the opposition sneered at them, his hand resting casually on the grip of his gun. "You thought you could just waltz in here and walk out," the man growled. "This is our territory, and you're not leaving with that kid." Jack didn't flinch. "I don't care who you are. You're not stopping us," he said coldly, his voice steady as steel. In that moment, all the bikers knew what was coming. There would be no turning back. The battle was inevitable. "Get ready," Jack whispered. "This won't be easy." Without another word, Bear lunged forward, taking the first man by surprise. A loud crash echoed through the hallway as the two collided. Wrench and Phantom were close behind, moving with precision, each strike calculated to incapacitate, not kill. Jack moved swiftly, keeping his focus on the boy. The last thing he wanted was for the kid to witness violence he didn't deserve, but there was no choice. The bikers were surrounded, and they had to protect themselves. A gunshot rang out, and the sound sliced through the air. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he saw Wrench duck just in time, narrowly avoiding the bullet that whizzed past his head. The bikers closed in on their opponents, fists and feet flying, while Jack kept his eyes on the boy. He had to stay focused. The boy's life depended on it. The noise of fists meeting flesh, grunts, and the occasional shout filled the air, but it was all background noise to Jack. He was thinking about the escape, about the moment they would get out of here. But the opposition wasn't backing down. More of them were pouring into the room from side doors, armed and angry. "We need to move," Jack shouted. The bikers knew what that meant. They had to push through. There was no time to waste. Jack grabbed the boy's arm and pulled him forward. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low. The boy nodded, his eyes wide with both fear and relief. He could sense the danger, but now, for the first time in hours, he was starting to believe he might actually get out of here. The bikers continued to fight their way through the building, pushing past the armed men who were doing everything they could to hold them back. Jack could feel the pressure mounting as they neared the exit, but the danger was far from over. The building felt like it was closing in around them, the narrow hallways and cluttered rooms making it difficult to maneuver. Just when they thought they were close to the exit, a final wave of attackers came from behind. Jack's heart raced. This was it. If they didn't make it out now, they were trapped. But just as things seemed to be spiraling out of control, the sound of motorcycles roared through the air. Jack's crew had made it. The rest of the bikers had arrived, and they weren't going to let anyone stand in their way. "Cover the rear," Jack ordered, as the backup bikers charged into the building, their motorcycles screeching to a halt in the hall. The sight of the bikes was like a sign of hope, a reminder that they weren't alone. The tables were turning. The reinforcements quickly surrounded the remaining attackers, creating a wall of leather and steel that no one could penetrate. "Get the kid out," Bear shouted as he pummeled one of the attackers to the ground. The bikers pushed forward, creating a path to the exit. Jack and the boy rushed ahead, followed by the rest of the crew. But just as they were about to break through the final set of doors, Jack heard a shout from behind. "You think you can get away that easily?" The voice was cold, filled with rage. Jack turned to see the leader of the opposition, gun drawn, aiming straight for them. Without thinking, Jack acted. He threw himself in front of the boy, his body, blocking the line of sight. The sound of another gunshot rang out. The world seemed to slow for a second. But before Jack could react, the roar of a motorcycle engine came from behind. Phantom, always quick on his feet, was right there. With a swift movement, he knocked the gun out of the man's hand, disarming him in an instant. The leader of the opposition staggered back, but it was too late. The bikers had already claimed victory. Jack's eyes never left the boy as he grabbed his arm and pulled him outside, the sound of the engines following them like a protective shield. They had made it. The danger was over, for now. The roar of the engines slowly faded as the bikers cleared the building, but the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. Jack looked at the boy, still clinging to him, his small face filled with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. They had made it out of the building, but the night wasn't over. They weren't safe yet. Jack could feel his heart pounding, but he had to stay focused. They had done what they came for, rescued the boy, but now they had to deal with the aftermath. The last thing Jack wanted was for the boy to see more violence, but he knew the threat wasn't over. The city, this block, it wasn't just full of criminals. It was full of people willing to do anything to protect their power, their secrets. And now, they had a target on their backs. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. The boy nodded, still trembling, but Jack could see the faintest flicker of relief in his eyes. "It's not over yet," Jack added quietly, "but we'll get you home." The bikers moved swiftly, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They weren't leaving anything to chance. The last thing they needed was a surprise attack. Bear and Wrench led the group, their massive frames covering the rear, while Phantom and Storm kept lookout ahead. Jack, the boy, and the rest followed closely behind. The streets outside the building were eerily quiet, the sound of the bikes echoing off the empty buildings as they sped through the dimly lit streets. Jack's mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy's family, his mother, and what they had just uncovered. The boy had been taken because of his connection to something much bigger than him, something that the people in that building were willing to kill to protect. Jack didn't know what it was yet, but he knew it was dangerous. The deeper they got into the city, the more Jack felt the weight of the boy's life pressing on him. He had made a promise to the boy's father, to protect his daughter. Now, the boy needed that same protection, and Jack wasn't about to break his promise. The bikes tore through the city, winding through narrow streets, their headlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The sound of their engines was the only thing breaking the silence of the night. Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened as he glanced over at the boy, still perched in front of him. The boy's eyes were wide, his hands clutching Jack's leather jacket, but he hadn't said a word since they left the building. Jack knew the boy was scared, but he also knew there was a lot more going on than the boy could understand. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. It was part of something bigger, something that had to do with the people they had just fought. Jack didn't want to explain everything to the boy just yet. He didn't need to hear about the criminal network, the corruption, and the dangerous people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But Jack needed to figure out what had happened. What were these people after? Why had they targeted this family? They had to know, and Jack was determined to find out. They reached a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of the city, far from the chaos they had just escaped. It was quiet here, too, but it felt safer. The bikes slowed as they approached, and Jack signaled for everyone to park. The bikers dismounted, stretching their legs, but their eyes were still alert. They weren't taking any chances. "Let's get him inside," Jack said, turning to the boy. "You're safe now." The boy nodded again, but Jack could tell he still didn't fully understand the gravity of what had just happened. He was scared, but relieved, his body finally able to relax now that they were out of immediate danger. Inside the motel, they secured the rooms and started to settle in. The boy sat on the edge of one bed, his legs dangling over the side. He looked up at Jack, his face a mix of confusion and gratitude. "Are we safe now?" the boy asked, his voice small. Jack knelt down beside him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "For now, you're safe," he said gently. "But there's more to this than you know, and we need to make sure it stays that way." Jack's mind raced with questions. What had they uncovered? What was so important about the boy's family that made them a target? And what were the next steps? The bikers were tough, but they didn't have all the answers. They needed information. They needed to get to the bottom of this before more lives were put in danger. "We need to figure out who's behind all this," Jack said, standing up and turning to the crew. "We'll stay here tonight and regroup. Tomorrow, we dig deeper." As the night wore on, the bikers settled into their rooms, their minds heavy with the weight of the situation. The boy, still in shock, finally laid down on the bed, his eyes closing as sleep overtook him. But Jack couldn't sleep. Not yet. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkened streets, knowing that their fight wasn't over. The night felt still, but Jack knew better than to believe it would stay that way. They had stirred something dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before it came for them. Jack wasn't afraid, but he wasn't naive either. This was far from over. The morning light filtered through the motel's dusty blinds, casting a muted glow across the room. Jack stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, but there was no time for rest. They had a mission, and it wasn't over yet. The boy was still asleep, his small form curled up on the bed, unaware of the full extent of what was going on. Jack knew it wouldn't take long for the danger to find them again. The bikers had been moving fast, but now they had to be smarter. He turned to look at the rest of the crew. They were all there, waiting for instructions. Bear was the first to speak. "What now?" he asked, his voice gruff but steady. Jack exhaled, glancing at the boy one last time before addressing the group. "We lay low for a bit," Jack said, "but we don't stop looking. We need answers." The crew nodded in agreement. There was no question about it. They were in this together, and they weren't going to back down. "Any word on the outside?" Jack asked Wrench, who was sitting by the door, his eyes scanning the street. Wrench looked up. "Nothing yet. But we can't stay here forever. If they're looking for us, we'll have to make a move soon." Jack agreed. He knew that staying in one place too long was dangerous. But they needed to figure out what had happened, what they had stumbled into. "We'll head to the warehouse district," Jack decided. "It's the last place they'll expect us to go. We'll find out who's behind all of this." The bikers didn't need more convincing. They packed up quickly, their movements efficient and purposeful. They knew that the faster they acted, the better their chances. As they mounted their bikes and roared out of the parking lot, the sound of their engines filled the air, a clear signal that they were ready for whatever was coming. The city felt different now, darker, more dangerous. The once familiar streets now seemed like a maze, full of hidden threats. But Jack wasn't afraid. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. The warehouse district was only a few miles away, but the ride felt longer, like they were being watched from every corner. The air grew thicker as they entered the industrial zone, the tall, rusted buildings looming overhead like silent sentinels. Jack led the way, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. The area was deserted, but Jack didn't trust that. The quiet was unsettling. As they neared an abandoned warehouse, Bear signaled for the group to stop. "This is it," Jack said, his voice low. They dismounted and approached the building cautiously, staying in the shadows. Jack could feel the tension in the air. They weren't sure what they were walking into, but they had to find out. Bear kicked open the door, and the bikers slipped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was empty, but there were signs of recent activity, discarded boxes, scattered papers, and a faint smell of tobacco. Jack motioned for the group to spread out. They moved silently, their boots barely making a sound against the concrete floor. As they made their way deeper into the building, Jack's heart began to race. This place felt wrong, too quiet, too still. "Over here," Wrench called out from the far side of the room. Jack and the others rushed over to where Wrench was standing. In the corner, half hidden behind a stack of crates, was a large wooden chest. It looked old, but there was something about it that made Jack uneasy. "What is it?" Bear asked, eyeing the chest warily. Jack bent down and ran his fingers over the surface. There were markings on the wood, symbols he didn't recognize. He looked at Wrench. "You think this is connected?" Wrench nodded. "It's possible, but we need to open it." Jack motioned for Phantom to check the chest. Phantom, always cautious, checked the locks. After a few tense seconds, the chest creaked open, revealing a collection of documents and photographs. Jack's heart sank as he sifted through the pile. These weren't just random papers, they were related to the boy's family. And that wasn't all. There were names, dates, and locations, connected to a much larger operation. "What the hell is this?" Wrench muttered as he scanned the papers. Jack didn't answer right away. He felt the weight of the discovery settle over him. This wasn't just a simple case of a kidnapper trying to make money. There were people involved, dangerous people, with ties to organizations that ran deep, far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The documents in front of him were a roadmap to something much bigger. Jack turned to the crew. "We're going to need more backup," he said. "This isn't just about one kid anymore. This is a full-blown operation, and we're in the middle of it." The bikers exchanged looks, their expressions hardening. They had no idea what they were up against, but they weren't about to back down. They had a job to finish, and no matter how deep the rabbit hole went, they were going to follow it to the end. Jack looked at the boy, who was now standing at the edge of the room, watching them. His eyes were filled with confusion, but Jack could see something else in them now. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to drive them forward. Jack knew that the kid was counting on them, and they weren't going to let him down. The sound of the bike's engines was a steady rhythm in the quiet night, a symbol of the bikers' resolve as they sped through the streets toward the next location. Jack's mind was focused, calculating the next move. They had found the chest, the documents, and the connection to a much larger operation, but now the stakes had been raised. The team had learned more than they expected, and the questions had only multiplied. Who were the people behind this operation? Why were they targeting the boy's family? And what would happen if they kept digging? Jack glanced over at the boy, still holding his jacket as they rode. His small hands clutched tight, fear still in his eyes but replaced with a glimmer of hope. For the first time since their escape, Jack felt like they were gaining ground, but the feeling was fleeting. The danger wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As they neared their destination, Jack could feel the air grow colder. The tension was palpable, thick with the weight of what they were about to face. "This is it," Bear said, his voice gruff, breaking the silence. They had arrived at a rundown warehouse in the industrial district, its steel walls cracked and covered in grime. The place was isolated, but something about it didn't sit right with Jack. It felt like they were walking into a trap. The crew dismounted, their boots hitting the concrete with a dull thud as they formed a tight circle. Wrench took a step forward, checking the entrance. There's no movement, but that doesn't mean it's safe, he said. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter. This wasn't just a place to hide. It was a strategic location. They had been here before, too many times to count, but this time, it felt different. Stay alert, Jack warned. We don't know who's waiting for us. With that, the crew moved toward the entrance, the heavy door creaking as they pushed it open. The smell of rust and dampness filled the air. Inside, the vast empty space seemed to swallow them whole. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. It was eerily silent. Jack signaled for the crew to spread out. They needed to find out what was going on here, and fast. They hadn't come this far just to walk away without answers. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes flicked toward the boy, who was trailing behind, still unsure, but trusting Jack and the crew. We'll keep you safe, Jack reassured him, his voice low but steady. But deep down, Jack wasn't sure. This was getting bigger than he ever imagined. They had to find out what was really happening before it was too late. A sudden sound broke the stillness, a faint shuffle of feet. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The others froze, their weapons ready. Did you hear that? Storm whispered, his hand tightening on his gun. Jack nodded, his body tensing as he motioned for everyone to stay low. They crept forward, their movements deliberate and quiet. The sound grew louder, closer now. Jack's instincts were on high alert. He could feel his pulse quicken as they neared the source. It's coming from the back, Phantom murmured, pointing toward a dark hallway at the far end of the warehouse. Jack motioned for the team to follow. As they made their way down the hallway, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. The sound of footsteps became more distinct. They were getting closer. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and Jack signaled for the others to stop. He placed his hand on the handle, taking a deep breath before slowly turning it. The door creaked open, and what they saw inside made Jack's stomach drop. The room was dimly lit, filled with crates, but it wasn't the crates that caught their attention. It was the men. There were 4 of them, sitting in a circle, talking in hushed tones. They looked up as the door opened, their eyes narrowing when they saw the bikers. You shouldn't be here, one of the men said, his voice low and dangerous. Jack stepped forward, his eyes hardening. We're looking for answers, he said, and we're not leaving without them. The man laughed, standing up slowly. You think you can just come in here and take what you want? You're in over your head, biker. Jack didn't flinch. You took the kid's family. You put him in danger. And now you're going to pay. The room went silent. The tension in the air was palpable. The men didn't move, but Jack could feel the weight of the situation. They weren't going to back down. The leader of the group, a tall man with dark eyes, stepped forward. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said. This isn't just a game for us. Jack stood tall, his eyes never leaving the man's. Then you won't mind telling us what this is all about. The man's expression hardened. You don't need to know, he said, his voice cold. You're too far in. It's already too late for you. Before Jack could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They weren't alone. More men had arrived, and this time, they were armed. The situation was escalating fast. Jack's mind raced. They had to get out of here now. He turned to Bear, who was already ready to move. Move out, Jack ordered. Get the kid to safety. The bikers moved quickly, their hands gripping their weapons as they prepared for what was coming. The room erupted into chaos as the men lunged forward, but Jack's crew was ready. The sound of fists meeting flesh, the crash of metal on metal, filled the room. Jack fought with everything he had, his focus on getting the boy to safety. They couldn't afford to lose him now. The chaos was overwhelming, but Jack pushed through, determined to protect the kid and get the answers they needed. The battle wasn't over, but it was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The room erupted into chaos, the sounds of fists slamming into bodies and the heavy thud of boots hitting the floor. Jack's heart raced as he ducked a punch, grabbing the nearest man by the collar and throwing him into the wall with a force that made the whole building shake. He could hear the boy's terrified voice calling for him, but Jack couldn't afford to turn his back now. Every second mattered. He needed to protect the kid and find out who these men were. As the room swarmed with attackers, Jack scanned the area, his mind working in overdrive. The bikers were holding their own, but it was clear they were outnumbered. They were used to fighting, but this wasn't just any battle. These men weren't just street thugs. They were organized, and they had the resources to make trouble. Jack caught a glimpse of Bear taking on 2 men at once, his massive fists landing with brutal precision. Wrench was close by, knocking another attacker to the ground with a swift kick. Phantom, always the silent one, moved like a shadow, taking down anyone who got too close. Jack's focus remained on the boy, who was cowering in the corner, his small frame trembling with fear. "Stay down, kid," Jack yelled, his voice barely audible over the noise. The boy nodded, his eyes wide with terror, but he didn't move. Jack didn't want him to see any more violence than he had to. They needed to get out of here. But the room was getting smaller, the walls closing in. The door they had entered through had been blocked by more of the attackers, and the windows were too high to climb out of. There was only one way out now, and it was through the group of men standing between them and the exit. Jack's pulse quickened. He had to get to the boy, but these men weren't going to let them leave that easily. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his face, stepped forward, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "You think you can walk out of here after what you've seen?" the man sneered. Jack took a step forward, his body tensing. "We don't have time for your games. We're leaving, and we're taking the kid with us." The man laughed, the sound low and menacing. "You're not in charge here, biker. You've stepped into something much bigger than you can handle." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I don't care what you think this is. I'm not leaving without that kid." The man's smile faded, and his hand went to the gun at his side. Jack knew they didn't have much time. The bikers were still fighting, but the attackers were regrouping. It was clear they were preparing for a bigger fight. Jack wasn't going to wait around for that. He moved toward the boy, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. "Come on, kid. We're leaving." But as Jack started to move toward the exit, the man with the scar stepped in front of them, blocking their way. "You really think you can just walk out of here?" the man spat. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the boy's arm. He wasn't going to let this man stand in his way. "You're right. I don't know who you are. But it doesn't matter." Without another word, Jack threw a punch, landing it square in the man's jaw. The man staggered back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he drew his gun and aimed it at Jack. "You're going to regret this." But just as the man pulled the trigger, Bear tackled him to the ground, knocking the gun out of his hand. "Move," Bear shouted, pulling the man away from Jack. The bikers quickly surrounded the remaining attackers, forcing them to back off. Jack didn't waste any time. He grabbed the boy by the hand and pushed through the group of bikers. "We're almost out," Jack said, his voice calm but urgent. The boy nodded, his small hand gripping Jack's tightly. But as they reached the door, another man stepped into the doorway, blocking their path. "You really think you're going to make it out?" the man said, his voice filled with venom. Jack didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, knocking the man aside with a powerful shove. The exit was clear, but there were more footsteps approaching. "Hurry," Jack shouted, as he pushed the boy toward the door. The bikers were right behind them, holding off the attackers long enough for them to escape. They rushed into the alleyway, the sounds of the fight still echoing behind them. "Go, go," Bear shouted, and the bikers followed Jack and the boy into the night. The streets were empty, but Jack wasn't about to stop yet. They had to get to safety, and they had to do it fast. The group rode in silence, the sound of their engines the only thing breaking the quiet. Jack kept glancing over at the boy, making sure he was okay. He couldn't let anything happen to him. They had come too far. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Jack's mind raced. They were getting close, but they couldn't afford to slow down. The danger was still out there, and they needed to find a safe place to regroup. But for the first time in hours, Jack allowed himself to feel a small glimmer of hope. They had made it out alive. The boy was safe, for now. The engines of the bikes roared through the empty streets, the sound cutting through the night like thunder. Jack's heart was still racing from the battle they had just narrowly escaped. The boy, clutching the back of Jack's leather jacket, sat silently behind him, his small hands gripping the fabric in a way that made Jack's chest tighten. The danger was far from over, but they had made it out of the warehouse. For now, that was enough. Jack could feel the boy's unease, the terror still fresh in his eyes, and it reminded him of the weight of his promise. He had told the boy's father he would protect his family. Jack wasn't about to fail him. The city seemed so much quieter now that they were away from the chaos, but Jack knew better than to trust the silence. He kept his eyes on the road, scanning the surroundings as the bikers made their way through the streets. Their destination was clear: get to the safe house. They needed to regroup, catch their breath, and figure out their next move. But something nagged at Jack's mind. The attack at the warehouse, the documents they had found, the people behind the operation, all of it pointed to something much bigger. And the bikers were now right in the middle of it. We need to keep moving, Jack muttered to himself, more to steady his nerves than anything else. The thought of stopping for even a moment felt dangerous. They needed to find answers, but they also needed to keep the boys safe. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. The safe house was a good distance from the city, nestled in a remote area where no one would expect them. Jack knew it well, an old cabin in the woods that had served as a hideout for the crew more times than he cared to count. It wasn't much, but it was secure, and that's all they needed for now. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Jack glanced back at the boy. His eyes were closed now, exhaustion finally taking over. Jack could only imagine what he had been through. Kidnapped, thrown into a dangerous game, and now, racing through the night on a motorcycle, trying to outrun the people who wanted him gone. Jack pushed the thoughts aside. There would be time to worry later. For now, they needed to focus on getting the boy to safety. The cabin came into view, a small silhouette against the dark forest, and Jack breathed a sigh of relief. They had made it. They parked the bikes in the clearing behind the cabin, out of sight from the road. The rest of the crew dismounted, their faces tense but determined. Jack turned to the boy, still holding his hand. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice steady but soft. The boy didn't say anything in return, just nodded, looking up at Jack with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Jack knew it wasn't over, but at least they had a moment of peace. The bikers secured the cabin, making sure the doors and windows were locked tight. Bear took the first watch, his massive frame standing guard at the front of the cabin, while the others settled inside, checking their gear and talking quietly. Wrench moved to the back of the cabin to monitor any movement from the trees. Jack didn't need to say anything. They all knew what was at stake. The boy was safe, for now. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The leader of the men they had fought at the warehouse was still out there. And whatever this operation was, it wasn't going to let them walk away that easily. Jack sat down at the small table, looking at the boy. "What happened to your family?" he asked gently. The boy's eyes welled up with tears, but he didn't say anything. Jack didn't push. The kid needed time. Jack had seen enough to know the kind of things people were capable of when they were desperate. And from the look on the boy's face, he had seen too much of it already. They didn't speak again for a while. The tension in the cabin hung thick in the air, but the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Jack's thoughts drifted to the documents they had found. Names, dates, places. This was bigger than just one family. Whoever was behind this had a network, and it stretched far beyond the city. They needed to figure out who was pulling the strings and what they wanted. But for now, all Jack could do was keep the boy safe and prepare for whatever came next. He looked up as the door creaked open. Bear stepped inside, his face grim. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Jack's pulse quickened. He had known it wouldn't be this easy. They had a small window of time, and it was closing fast. "How many?" Jack asked. Bear didn't answer immediately. He just looked out the window, his eyes scanning the trees beyond. "Enough to cause problems," he finally said. Jack stood, his mind already shifting into action mode. They had to move quickly, but they couldn't risk exposing themselves. The boys' safety was their top priority, but Jack knew this fight was far from over. The silence outside was now broken by the unmistakable sound of approaching engines. The hunt had begun again. The sounds of the approaching engines grew louder as they cut through the still night air, the unmistakable roar of motorcycles signaling that they were not alone. Jack's pulse quickened, his instincts sharpening. The safe house had never been a permanent solution. He had known they would be found eventually, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Bear had already taken up his position at the front window, scanning the woods beyond for any signs of movement. "They're getting closer," Bear muttered, his voice steady but grim. Jack nodded, his mind working quickly. The boy, still wide-eyed and frightened, had been lying on the bed, trying to sleep, but the tension in the room had kept him awake. Jack could see the fear in his eyes, but also the silent understanding that danger was never far behind. "Stay close, kid," Jack said softly, his voice reassuring but firm. The boy nodded, clutching the edge of the bedspread tightly. Jack turned to the rest of the crew. "We're going to have to move fast," he said, his voice low, but full of authority. "We don't have much time. We make our stand here if we have to, but I don't plan on staying. We need to get to the backup location." Wrench, who had been keeping watch by the back door, stepped forward. "How many are there?" he asked, his eyes scanning the shadows outside. "I'm guessing at least 4 or 5 bikes, maybe more," Bear replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Jack nodded. "We'll fight our way out if we have to, but we keep the kids safe." The rest of the crew readied their gear, checking their weapons and preparing for whatever was coming. Jack moved toward the door, his mind focused on the task at hand. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The plan was simple: stay mobile, move quickly, and get out of the cabin without attracting too much attention. But as the bikes neared, Jack knew it wouldn't be that easy. The attackers weren't just any group. They were organized, and they had the manpower to make this difficult. Jack turned back to the boy, who was now standing by the door, his small hands trembling. "You're going to be okay," Jack said, crouching down to meet his eyes. The boy nodded, but Jack could see the fear still lingering in his gaze. Jack squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "Just stay with me, and we'll get you through this." With that, he motioned for the others to follow him. Bear, Wrench, and Phantom positioned themselves by the windows and doorways, keeping watch for any sign of movement. Jack knew they didn't have much time before their position was compromised. They were close to being discovered, and if they weren't careful, the attackers would be upon them before they could react. "They're almost here," Wrench said, his voice tight. "Ready yourself." Jack gave him a single nod. "We fight if we have to, but our priority is getting the kid out." Just as the sound of the motorcycles reached its peak, the door to the cabin suddenly swung open, and 5 armed men stormed in. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his cool. The bikers had been prepared for this. There was no backing down now. The leader of the group, a man with a long scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "You think you can just run?" the man sneered. "You've already made too many enemies." Jack stepped forward, his voice low and calm. "You took the wrong kid," he said, "and now you're going to pay for it." The man laughed, taking a step closer. "You think you can stop us? We're everywhere. You'll never get out of here." Jack didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he lunged at the man, landing a punch square to his jaw. The man staggered back, momentarily stunned, but he quickly regained his footing, drawing a knife from his belt. The other attackers advanced, but the bikers were already in motion. Bear and Phantom moved in to take down the other men, their fists and feet working in unison, taking out the attackers with quick, precise moves. Wrench, always the quiet one, handled the remaining enemy, his focus unshakable as he disarmed one of the attackers. Jack didn't waste any time. He turned to the boy, who was watching in wide-eyed horror, but there was no time to comfort him now. They had to keep moving. "Go," Jack shouted, his voice commanding as he pulled the boy toward the back exit. The boy, still shaking, followed Jack without question, his feet stumbling as he tried to keep up. Jack glanced over his shoulder to make sure the others were following, and when he saw they were, he pushed through the back door. The sound of the fight still echoed in the cabin behind them, but Jack didn't look back. They were almost out. The bikers were ready to take on whatever came next. As they ran through the woods, the sounds of the motorcycles grew louder. They were in the clear, for now. Jack felt a brief moment of relief, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down. The city was closing in on them, and the fight was far from over. They had a long road ahead. "We've got to keep moving," Jack said, as he pushed through the thick underbrush, guiding the boy along. The others were close behind, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the attackers. The sound of engines was getting closer. Jack's heart raced again. They had to get to the backup location before they were caught. Every step felt like an eternity, but there was no turning back now. They had come too far to stop. Jack kept his focus, his mind set on one goal: get the boy to safety. But with every turn, the danger seemed to grow closer. The attackers weren't far behind, and Jack knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. The night was closing in on them as Jack and the boy moved deeper into the woods, their steps muffled by the thick underbrush beneath their feet. The sounds of their pursuers' motorcycles were now distant, but Jack knew that wouldn't last. He kept his pace steady, though every nerve in his body was on edge. The boy, still clutching Jack's jacket, struggled to keep up. His small legs were no match for the biker's long strides. but Jack wasn't going to leave him behind. "Come on, kid," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're almost there." The boy nodded, but Jack could see the exhaustion in his face. His body was still trembling from the night's events. They had come too far, fought too hard, and now they just had to get to safety. The safe house was only a few more miles ahead, hidden in the trees. But Jack knew that getting there wasn't guaranteed. They weren't out of danger yet. They had to keep moving. Jack looked back toward the clearing they had just passed. He could still hear the faint sound of engines in the distance, but it was hard to tell whether they were being followed or if it was just the echoes of the world settling into the night. It didn't matter. Either way, Jack wasn't about to slow down. He could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the promise he made to the boy's father to keep him safe. The boy's family was already torn apart. Jack couldn't afford to fail him now. The trees thickened as they moved further from the main road, and the faint sounds of the forest took over. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, and the soft crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Jack kept his senses sharp, scanning the surroundings, but the boy seemed to relax, just slightly, in the peacefulness of the woods. It was a fleeting moment of calm, and Jack appreciated it. He glanced back at the boy, who was now walking beside him, a little steadier on his feet. The boy's eyes were wide, and there was still fear in them, but Jack could see the hint of trust. He had seen enough in the boy's eyes to know that he was starting to believe he would make it out of this alive. They reached a small creek, its water trickling softly over smooth stones. Jack knelt down, dipping his hand into the cool water to refresh himself. The boy did the same, splashing his face with the clear water before sitting down on a rock, catching his breath. "We're almost there, kid," Jack reassured him. The boy nodded but didn't say anything. Jack sat down next to him, taking a moment to catch his own breath. "How long have you been running?" Jack asked quietly. The boy hesitated, his small fingers picking at the fabric of his shirt. "A few days. I don't know. It's hard to remember," the boy said, his voice small. Jack nodded, understanding. He couldn't imagine what the boy had been through, being torn from his home, taken by strangers, and now running from people who would do anything to stop them from escaping. "You're strong," Jack said, his voice calm and encouraging. "We're going to get you through this." The boy looked up at him, his eyes searching Jack's face for some sign of certainty. Jack gave him a small smile, hoping it would bring him some comfort. "Do you know what happened to your family?" Jack asked. The boy looked down, his expression growing somber. They took my mom," he whispered. "I think they're going to hurt her." Jack's heart clenched. He had known the situation was dire, but hearing it from the boy made it all the more real. Whoever these people were, they had no intention of stopping. "We'll find your mom," Jack said, his voice steady, even though the knot in his stomach was tightening. "We'll get her back." The boy didn't respond, but Jack could see the flicker of hope in his eyes. That was all Jack needed to see. They couldn't stop now. They were close, so close to getting to safety, but Jack knew they had to keep moving. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps crunching on the ground ahead. Jack immediately stood, signaling for the boy to stay behind him. He scanned the area, his instincts kicking in. It wasn't just the wind, someone was coming. He crouched down, motioning for the rest of the crew to follow his lead. They had to remain unseen. The sound grew louder, and Jack's grip tightened on his weapon. His eyes scanned the trees, but the figure wasn't visible yet. His heart raced as he took a deep breath, preparing for whatever came next. As the figure stepped into the clearing, Jack's hand instinctively went to his gun, but then he saw who it was. It was Phantom, his silhouette barely visible in the fading light. Jack lowered his weapon, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. Phantom motioned for the others to follow. "We've got company," Phantom whispered, his voice low and urgent. "More of them?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "Yes," Phantom confirmed. "But we're not far from the safe house. We just need to hold them off for a little longer." Jack nodded, glancing at the boy. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "We're almost there." With Phantom in the lead, the crew moved quickly through the trees, staying low, their steps light as they made their way toward the safe house. Jack's mind raced, but he remained calm. The danger wasn't over, but they were getting closer to safety. And for the first time in a long while, Jack allowed himself to believe they might actually make it. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer now, and Jack's senses heightened. Phantom, who had been scouting ahead, motioned for everyone to halt, his body tensed with anticipation. Jack looked at him, his hand still resting on the boy's shoulder, ready to move at a moment's notice. They couldn't afford to be seen. The boy, sensing the change in atmosphere, instinctively pressed closer to Jack, his small frame quivering. Jack whispered softly to him, "Stay close, kid. We'll be all right." Phantom crouched low, scanning the path ahead. His eyes narrowed, and he signaled with a swift motion. 2 men, walking this way. Jack's pulse quickened. They didn't have the luxury of time. The safe house was close, so close, but they were being hunted, and every step carried more risk. He motioned to the crew. "Get ready." Bear, Wrench, and Storm all took their positions, silently moving into place. Jack's heart raced as he weighed their options. If they fought now, they risked alerting the rest of the group. If they ran, they'd be exposed. But there was no time to strategize further. They had to act. Jack's eyes flicked toward Phantom, who gave a slight nod. "We take them out silently. Move fast." The rest of the crew nodded in agreement. They had done this before, many times. But something about this felt different. The boy, though safe for now, was still vulnerable. Jack couldn't risk him seeing any more violence. Jack motioned for Bear to move first, and the giant biker moved with surprising speed for his size. Bear crouched low, moving behind a cluster of trees as the 2 men came closer. Jack held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. As the 2 men passed their position, Bear lunged, grabbing one by the throat, silencing him before he could make a sound. The other man spun around, but Wrench was already on him, a swift punch knocking him out cold. The men were down, and Jack felt a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. More would come. Always more. "Clear," Bear whispered, his voice low. Jack gave a quick nod, signaling for the others to move. "Let's go. We've got to get to the safe house." They moved quickly, taking the narrow paths through the woods, their footsteps barely making a sound on the forest floor. Jack glanced over at the boy, who was now walking a little faster, though his face still held the same wide-eyed look of fear and confusion. Jack kept his pace steady, his hand never straying far from the boy's shoulder. The boy still had so many questions, but Jack couldn't answer them all. "Not yet. We're close," Jack said, his voice calm and reassuring, though he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The sound of the engines from earlier seemed to fade as they moved deeper into the woods, but Jack knew they wouldn't be safe for long. As they neared the safe house, Jack's mind raced. He could feel his muscles aching from the tension, the constant adrenaline that surged through him. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The bikers had been through many battles, but this was different. They were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to uncover the truth. The safe house, an old cabin nestled in the woods, finally came into view. Jack could see the dim light coming from the small window, signaling that it was still secure. They had made it. Jack led the way, his eyes darting from side to side, making sure they weren't being followed. The others were close behind, moving silently through the trees. They reached the cabin in record time, and Jack pushed open the creaking door, letting everyone in. As the last biker entered, Jack quickly shut the door behind him, locking it with a heavy bolt. They had made it, but Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down. "Not yet. We'll rest here for a while," Jack said, his voice firm. "But we can't stay long. We need to figure out what's going on." The boy, now sitting on the floor by the hearth, looked up at him. His eyes were filled with fear, but also something else, hope. Jack could see that the boy was starting to believe they would make it out of this alive. Jack turned to the rest of the crew. "We'll need to check the perimeter, make sure no one's tracking us." Bear moved toward the window, peering out into the night. "I'll keep watch." Jack nodded. He trusted Bear with his life. The others began to settle in, but Jack couldn't relax. He knew the boy wasn't the only one in danger. Whoever was behind this operation wouldn't just stop. They had come too close to the truth, and now Jack had to make sure they finished it. He turned to the boy again, his face softening. "We're not leaving you, kid. We'll get your mom back." The boy nodded, his eyes still wide but now filled with a quiet understanding. Jack felt a pang in his chest, but he didn't show it. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. They would find out who was behind the kidnapping and put an end to this once and for all. Jack moved toward the small table in the center of the room, where the documents they had found earlier were spread out. He couldn't make sense of them yet, but he knew they held the key to everything. His eyes scanned the papers again. Names, locations, dates, all leading back to something much bigger than they had anticipated. This was just the beginning. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire in the corner and the occasional rustle of paper as Jack sifted through the documents. The boy sat nearby, his eyes focused on the pile of papers, his face a mixture of confusion and anxiety. Jack could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The promises he made, the people they were up against, and the responsibility of protecting the kid. His crew was gathered around the cabin, keeping watch, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. He knew the attackers wouldn't stop. They had only bought themselves a brief reprieve, but it wouldn't last long. The safe house was just a temporary hideout, and Jack was fully aware that the enemy would be coming for them, no matter how many miles they had put between themselves and the city. He had to find out what this was all about, who was behind it, and how to put an end to it. The papers in front of him seemed like the key, but the more he read, the more complicated it became. Names, codes, locations, they didn't form a clear picture. But Jack knew there was something bigger here, something that could change everything. The boy's mother was still out there, and Jack wasn't about to let them suffer any longer. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice resolute. The others in the room looked up at him. "It's time to take the fight to them." Wrench looked skeptical. "You sure? We've got no clear lead, Jack." "The docks," Jack cut him off. "We have enough." He met Wrench's eyes, and the rest of the crew could see the determination in his face. "We know enough now. We know they're connected to something bigger, and we know they won't stop until they get what they want. It's time we go to them. We finish this." The room was still for a moment, and then Bear nodded. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady. "Let's take it to them." Jack didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The crew was ready. They all understood what was at stake. The boy was still sitting quietly, watching Jack and the others, but his eyes were no longer filled with fear. There was a quiet trust in them now, a hope that hadn't been there before. Jack's heart tightened as he looked at the kid, but he didn't let it show. He had made a promise to the boy's father to keep his family safe, and he wasn't going to break that promise now. Jack moved toward the door, the others following closely behind. They would leave the cabin in the cover of darkness, moving fast and quietly, knowing that any moment they could be surrounded. As they stepped outside, the cool night air hit Jack's face, and he took a deep breath. The tension was unbearable, but they were committed. They would find out everything. They would make sure the boy's family was safe. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, but in the distance, Jack could hear the faint hum of engines. His heart skipped a beat. It was them, more of the enemy. They weren't far behind. Jack motioned for the crew to move quickly, taking the lead as they slipped into the trees. The boy, still close behind, moved faster now, his steps more confident. Jack felt the weight of the situation more than ever. This was it. No more running. It was time for action. They moved swiftly through the trees, the sounds of the enemy getting louder. Jack's mind was sharp as he plotted their next move. He would not let them get caught again. They needed to push forward, find the source of the operation, and take it down. They were close. Very close. As they reached a clearing, Jack stopped. He motioned for the group to crouch low. They could hear the men ahead, their voices drifting through the air. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They had to move now. He signaled for Bear to take the left, Wrench to cover the right, and Phantom to stay behind them. Jack would lead the boy straight through the center, making sure they were covered at every angle. They were in position, but the tension was unbearable. The boy was staring at Jack, his eyes wide, but there was a new sense of calm about him. Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stick with me," he said, his voice a low whisper. "We'll make it out." The boy nodded, but Jack could see the fear was still there. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of everything he had been through. Jack couldn't protect him from everything, but he could make sure he didn't face this alone. "Ready," Bear said, his voice low, ready for the next move. Jack nodded. "Let's go." They moved quickly, cutting through the clearing toward the voices. The closer they got, the more Jack could make out. Two men were standing by an old truck, talking. They didn't see the bikers coming. With a swift motion, Jack raised his hand, signaling for them to take action. Bear, Phantom, and Wrench moved in silently, their movements fluid and deadly. Jack stepped forward, leading the boy behind him, keeping him out of sight. The men were down before they even realized what was happening. Jack could feel the tension lift for just a moment, but he knew it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As the men lay motionless on the ground, Jack moved to the truck. He opened the door quietly, looking inside. More papers, more clues. The operation was bigger than they could have imagined. They had to keep moving forward. "We have to get to the source," Jack said, his voice steady. "We can't stop now. This goes all the way to the top." Bear nodded. "Let's finish it." The crew gathered their things, ready for whatever came next. Jack turned to the boy, giving him a small smile. "We're getting you home," he promised. The boy smiled back, his eyes filled with a sense of hope he hadn't had before. They were going to finish this. They were going to win. In this thrilling Hell Angels stories, a group of bikers is thrust into a dangerous situation when a young boy's family is targeted by a ruthless criminal organization. As they fight to protect the boy and uncover the dark secrets behind the kidnapping, the Hell Angels stories take unexpected turns, showcasing their strength, loyalty, and determination. The crew, led by Jack, faces danger at every corner, from ambushes in abandoned warehouses to confrontations with dangerous enemies. But they push forward, driven by their promise to protect the innocent and bring justice to those responsible. These Hell Angels stories explore not just the gritty action, but also the bonds formed in the heat of battle, as well as the unwavering resolve to see the mission through. As they uncover more clues and face even greater threats, the Hell Angels stories unfold into an intense journey of survival and redemption, with Jack and his crew doing whatever it takes to save the boy and stop the sinister force behind the operation. Join them in these Hell Angels stories, where courage, loyalty, and the will to fight for what's right define their journey, and discover how far they will go to make things right.